I'm not going to hurt you.
The chain moved before she did. That was the thing Nora Callahan would never quite be able to explain to anyone who asked later. That she heard it first. That metallic drag across frozen ground, rhythmic and wrong, somewhere in the white dark of the Absaroka ridge, and that her feet stopped before her mind had formed a single coherent thought about why. She had been walking for 4 hours. Her pack held 22 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of salt, lamp oil enough for 6 weeks, and a tin of tobacco she didn't smoke but kept for trading. The pass had narrowed in the last mile into a corridor of lodgepole pine so dense the snow barely reached the ground, and the light had gone from gray to the particular bluish dark that meant she had maybe 40 minutes before what remained of November's sun gave up entirely. She should have kept walking. She turned off the trail. The sound was coming from a granite hollow set back 30 yards from the main path, a shallow bowl of rock and root she had passed 100 times in 3 years of crossing this ridge without once looking into it. She picked her way through the pine, ducking a low branch, stepping over a buried root that caught her boot and nearly took her down. And then she came around the boulder at the hollow's edge, and she saw him. The wolf was white. Not gray-white, not the dirty cream of the wolves she had seen twice before at distance. White, the way snow is white, clean and absolute. He was the largest wolf she had ever seen in her life or her imagination. His shoulders stood nearly level with her waist, and he was lying on his side in the hollow, with his left foreleg stretched out before him, clamped in the iron jaw of a New House No. 6 trap. A chain running from the trap to a stake driven between 2 roots. The blood around the leg had frozen into the fur in dark, rust-colored petals. He saw her the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved. His eyes were pale blue, nearly white at the edges, and they held her the way deep water holds you. Not pulling, just present, just open. The specific gaze of something that has decided it is done running, and is now simply watching to see what the world does next. Nora's pack was still on her back. Her skinning knife was still on her hip. Her feet were cold enough that she could no longer fully feel her smallest toe on the right side, and the 40 minutes of daylight she had told herself she could not spare were already starting to disappear. She put her pack down in the snow. She pushed it back against the boulder at the hollow's edge, out of the space between them. She sat down beside it. She sat down 10 feet from perhaps 160 pounds of trapped wolf, and she did not move toward him, and she did not move away. She just sat there, feeling the cold come up through her wool skirts, breathing in the pine and iron smell of the hollow, listening to the wind cut through the trees above them. She started talking. Not to him exactly, the way she hadn't talked to Thomas exactly those last 3 nights, when the fever had taken his reason, but not yet his hearing. Just words, low and even. Words that didn't need to mean anything beyond the sound of them. The sound of a human voice that was not coming closer, not threatening, simply present and steady in the dark. "You've been here a while," she said. "I can see that." The wolf's sides moved in and out. His breath came in short bursts, fogging the air between them. "I'm going to sit here for a bit. That's all I'm doing." She moved her right hand 6 inches forward in the snow, palm down, and waited. There is a particular quality to the moment just before trust is given across an impossible distance. A stillness so complete it almost hurts. A suspended breath the world takes before it changes. Some things in this life arrive only once, unannounced and unrepeatable. Those who are paying attention recognize them. Those who aren't, let them pass and spend years afterward trying to name the thing they missed. If you have ever stayed in a difficult moment, when everything in you was screaming to leave. If you have ever held your hand out towards something that frightened you and waited, simply waited, then you know exactly where Nora Callahan was in that moment. Stay with me, because what happens next, and everything it cost her, is the part of this story that the history books left out entirely. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on your notifications, because this is only the beginning of what she survived. She moved her hand again, and then again, and again after that, each time waiting, each time watching, the 10 feet between them becoming 8, becoming 5, becoming less than the length of her arm. The wolf watched it. She moved it one last time. She was close enough now to see the individual hairs on his muzzle, the frost that had gathered in his brow fur, the way his nostrils flared each time she exhaled. She was close enough that if she reached out fully, she could touch the trap. Her knife was in her right hand. She didn't remember drawing it, but there it was, warm from her hip, the blade open. She reached for the trap mechanism with her left hand. The wolf lunged. Not a full lunge. He was chained. His leg was ruined. His body was 3 days into an exhaustion that would have killed most animals by now. But the sudden explosive surge of him, the snap of his teeth, the full-throated sound that came out of him, it was enough. The knife left her hand. It went somewhere behind her into the snow, and she did not watch it go, because she was flat on her stomach in the hollow, her right hand outstretched, her face 6 inches from his face, and she had not moved. She did not know why she had not moved. She would think about it for years. His breath hit her skin in short, furious bursts. His eyes were enormous. And then, so slowly she thought she was imagining it, something in them changed. Not softness exactly. Something more complicated than softness. Something that lived on the other side of a decision she would never be able to name. He settled. She found the trap mechanism with both hands and worked it. Her fingers had lost significant feeling. The mechanism was rusted at the hinge, stiff in a way that required her full grip to move, and she worked it for what felt like a long time, the wolf still and watching. Until the jaws gave, a sudden release, a sound like a single word spoken in the language she didn't speak, and his leg was free. He stood. He tested the leg, putting weight on it slowly, then more. He lifted his head and looked at her directly for a long moment that Nora later wrote about only once in a journal entry dated January 82. The most complete silence I have ever been inside. Then he turned and walked into the tree line and was gone. Nora stayed in the hollow for another 10 minutes. She found her knife in the snow. She sat holding it without doing anything with it. Before she left, she turned the trap over, stamped into the iron plate on the underside, in letters that had been pressed there with deliberate permanence. HRC, Holt Range Company. She knew what that meant. Every person in the valley knew what that meant. She knew that this trap had been set on open range, which was against territorial law. She knew that Silas Holt had the ear of every judge between Clearwater and Cheyenne. She knew that she was a widow, alone on 160 acres, and that knowledge was a thing you could not unknow once it had entered you. She set the trap back in the snow. She took nothing. She pulled her pack onto her back and climbed out of the hollow and walked the remaining 2 miles to her homestead in the last of the light. She fed her horses. She checked her chickens. She built her fire and pulled her boots off and put her feet near the grate and sat there in the good animal warmth of it, and she was almost settled when the knock came at the door. Peter Gruber was 17, still growing into his father's height, and he had ridden over from the south pasture with a folded paper and the look of a boy who was glad he only had to deliver something, not explain it. "From Marshal Marsh," he said. "He said you'd be expecting it." She was not expecting it. She read the summons twice by lamplight. Silas Holt had filed a complaint with the U.S. Marshal's Office. Interference with private property. Livestock endangerment. She was required to present herself in Clearwater in 4 days' time. Nora held the paper and looked at her hands. The scraped knuckles, the chain-burned wrist, the dried blood dark as rust in the creases of her palm. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She folded the paper and slid it under her Bible. She went to bed. The fire burned down in the grate. The paper sat beneath the Bible. Outside her window, the ridge stood black against a sky full of cold stars, and somewhere up in that dark, in the pine and the granite and the frozen silence above her land, the wolf was there. She didn't know that yet, but she would. 4 days is not a long time when you are building a fence or planting a field. 4 days is a very long time when you are waiting to be judged. Nora rode into Clearwater on the morning of the 4th day with her best coat brushed clean and her hair pinned flat and her face arranged into the expression she had learned, in 3 years of being a widow on the frontier, was the safest thing a woman could wear in a room full of men who had already decided what she was. Attentive, calm, and entirely without apology. The town hall sat at the north end of Clearwater's main street, a low, wide building of rough-cut timber that had started life as a granary and never quite escaped its origins. It smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular damp of a space not built for human gathering that gets filled with humans anyway. By the time Nora arrived, there were perhaps 30 people inside, seated on benches and leaning against the walls, and she understood within 10 steps of the door that every one of them had come for a reason. The women nearest the plank table at the center of the room shifted in their chairs as she passed. Not dramatically. 1 inch, maybe 2. Enough. Silas Holt was already seated at the far end of the table. He was a large man, Silas Holt. Not fat, but built in the way of men who have spent decades believing the world should accommodate their size. He wore a dark coat without a wrinkle in it, and he had the unhurried posture of someone who had never once in his adult life been required to wait. His lawyer, a thin man named Gideon Price, sat at his left elbow with a leather case on his knees. Holt did not look at Nora when she entered. That was the first thing she noticed. Not hostility. Indifference. She was an inconvenience to be processed, not an opponent to be watched. Cray Marsh sat at the head of the table in his deputy marshal's coat, his hat on the bench beside him. He looked at Nora when she took her place at the near end and gave her a nod that communicated precisely nothing. Holt spoke first. He had not been invited to speak first. He simply began, in the measured tone of a man recounting a business transaction. The wolf, he said, had killed 2 calves on his southern grazing land in October. The trap had been set on his range by his authority, he said. And here Price produced a land survey that Nora could not see clearly from her end of the table, as was his right under territorial law for predator control. The destruction of his lawful property was a matter for the marshal to resolve. He had no interest in pursuing the criminal question of reckless endangerment, he said, and he said this in a way that made very clear he did have that interest, but was being magnanimous in setting it aside. He had no quarrel with widows managing difficult situations alone. He said the word alone the way you press a bruise. Nora kept her face exactly where she had put it. She looked at Cray Marsh. Cray Marsh wrote something in his notebook. She had prepared a statement. 3 sentences, precise and dry. She had gotten through 1.5 of them when the door at the back of the room opened, and a draft came through that moved the lamp flames and turned every head in the building. Eli Running Water came in and closed the door behind him. He was a lean man, Eli, with a face that had been weathered into clean angles by 30 years of outdoor work, and he moved through the parted crowd with the specific economy of someone who has long since stopped spending energy on rooms that don't want him in them. He carried a roll of survey maps under one arm and a field journal under the other, and he walked to the table and placed them both in front of Cray Marsh without asking permission. "I have 3 years of tracking records," he said, "for the white wolf on the Absaroka Ridge." The room went the particular quiet of a space in which a truth has arrived that nobody sent for. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Holt. He opened the field journal to a page dense with notation and turned it so Marsh could read it. And then he explained, in plain English, what the records showed. That the white wolf had not been within 2 miles of Holt's southern grazing land in any of the 3 years documented. That the calf kills in October bore the specific characteristics of a younger, smaller wolf whose tracks he had also documented, a separate animal entirely. And that the new house trap had been placed inside a surveyor's exclusion zone established in the territorial boundary settlement of 1874, which made its placement not a matter of Holt's discretion, but a matter of federal violation. He closed the journal. "I can leave these records with the court," he said, "if the court would like them." Cray Marsh looked at the journal for a long moment. "I would like them," he said. It was the most Nora had ever heard Cray Marsh want anything. Silas Holt had not moved. He had not changed expression. He sat with his large hands folded on the table and waited for Eli to return to the back of the room. And then he looked at Gideon Price, and Price picked up the leather case from his knees and removed a single folded document and placed it on the center of the table. "Given the complexity of the matter," Price said, "my client feels it is relevant to bring to the court's attention an outstanding debt against the Callahan homestead." Nora looked at the document. She recognized the handwriting before she could read the words. She would have recognized that handwriting blind, in the dark, with her hands. Thomas, March 1875. $140, borrowed against the following spring's seed stock. Witnessed by 2 names she did not know. Signed in her husband's careful schoolboy hand. She looked at it for what felt like a very long time. She had known Thomas's every financial arrangement. She had kept the accounts herself from the 2nd year of their marriage, after the first winter had taught her what warm generosity could cost when it met a hard season. She had never seen this document. She had never heard Thomas speak of any debt to Silas Holt or to anyone connected with him. She wondered, not for the first time, whether there were things a man kept only in his own chest, separate from every ledger, because he believed the need to tell them would pass before it arrived. $140 in 1875 was the difference between a homestead that survived and one that didn't. And Thomas had not told her. The hearing closed 20 minutes later without resolution. Marsh said he would review the evidence and issue a determination within the week. Nobody spoke to Nora on her way out. She found herself in the back room of Whitmore's General Store 20 minutes later, with no clear memory of having decided to go there. She was standing with her hand on a bolt of blue cotton she had no use for, not seeing it, when Eli came through the narrow door from the main shop and stopped a few feet away and waited until she looked up. "There is something else you should know," he said. He told her without preamble. The white wolf had denned within a quarter mile of her homestead the previous winter. The Shoshone who traveled that ridge had watched him for years, far longer than Eli's own records reached. He said the wolf's name in Shoshone, a short phrase that moved through the room's dusty air and settled. It meant, as closely as any translation could manage, the one who watches from the ridge. "The trap was set on his route," Eli said. "The path he uses when he goes down toward your land." The blue cotton was rough under her fingers. She became aware of it suddenly, that roughness. "He has driven off at least one coyote pack that would have reached your chickens," Eli said. "I have not been able to document it formally, but I have seen it." She took a breath. "Why would he come back?" she said. It was not quite a question. Eli looked at her for a moment with the patience of a man who has learned which answers to say aloud and which to let stand. "The same reason anything comes back to a place," he said. She rode the 12 miles home in the last usable hour of daylight, alone on the valley road, working through the inventory of what she had. The land under her feet. 160 acres, documented in the Cheyenne Land Office, legally filed. Thomas's tools in the barn. Thomas's fencing. 3 years of careful post setting around the north and east pastures. Thomas's irrigation channels, which she had extended by 40 yards last summer on her own, with a borrowed spade and 3 weeks of mornings before the heat came. What she had was everything Thomas had built, and everything she had built on top of it, and 3 years of her own survival piled on top of that. And it was possible that all of it rested on a piece of paper, signed in a borrowed barn in the spring of 1875 by a man who had believed, as good men sometimes do, that the debt would resolve itself before it mattered. She crested the ridge above the homestead as the last light turned the snow from white to the pale rose gold it went just before dark. Below her, the house, the barn, the thin column of wood smoke rising from the chimney she had repaired herself the autumn after Thomas died. She stopped her horse. On the far ridge, in the last of the rose light, the wolf stood still against the darkening sky, white and enormous and watchful, exactly as he had been in the hollow. He was looking in her direction with the complete, unhurried attention of something that has decided a thing and is no longer in any doubt about it. Nora sat her horse and looked back at him until the light failed and he became part of the dark. Then she clicked her horse forward and rode down toward her land. She did not look back. But something in her jaw had set into a line it hadn't found since the morning after Thomas's burial, when she had gotten up before the sun and built a fire and stood at her window watching the ridge come out of the dark, and made a decision so quiet and total it had never needed to be spoken aloud. She was not leaving, then or now. She had a plan. It was small and careful, and it would require Eli's help and a great deal of luck, and she was going to begin it in the morning. What she did not know, and would not know until the smell woke her at 3 in the morning, 3 weeks later, was that Silas Holt also had a plan. His did not require luck. His required only darkness, and 2 men who asked no questions, and a lantern, and a barn full of dry hay. The third draft was better than the second. The second had been better than the first, which Nora had written in one sitting the evening after the hearing, and then burned in the grate because the anger in it was too visible. Anger was a luxury she could not afford in a legal document. Anger told men like Silas Holt exactly where to press. 3 weeks had passed since Clearwater. November had settled into the valley like a stone, cold and final. And Nora had learned the shape of the waiting, how to live inside it without letting it hollow her out. She rose at the same hour. She worked the same hours. She kept the same fire. She did not allow herself to imagine losing the land because the imagination of a thing, she had found, had a way of making room for it. She and Eli had met twice a week at the surveyor's office in Clearwater, Eli arriving with his field map rolls, as he always did, Nora arriving to drop off correspondence, as she always had. 2 people whose business in the same building at the same hour required no explanation from either of them. They worked at opposite ends of a long table with the door open, speaking quietly, building the filing paragraph by careful paragraph. The letter cited 3 things: the territorial code governing trap placement on open range, the exclusion zone boundary coordinates from the 1874 settlement survey, and Holt's trap registry number, which Eli had copied from the iron stamp the same afternoon Nora had described it to him. Appended to the letter were Eli's 3 years of field records, his tracking maps, and a signed statement from a Shoshone elder who had watched the white wolf on that ridge since before Eli had begun his documentation. It was not a dramatic document. It did not accuse. It did not plead. It simply placed a set of facts in a specific order and allowed them to stand in a room together. Eli read the final draft on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, standing at the window of the surveyor's office with the pale winter light coming over his shoulder. He turned the last page. He was quiet for a moment. "This is good," he said. Then he looked up at her. "This is very good." Nora took the pages back, tapped them square against the table, folded them into the envelope she had already addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and pressed the wax seal with her thumb. She rode home in the late afternoon and made her supper and fed her animals, and went to bed at the same hour she always did. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of ordinary days wrapped around an extraordinary effort, and no indication from Silas Holt's direction that anything was coming. That was the thing about men like Silas Holt. They did not come at you in the daylight. She smelled it before she was fully awake. Wood smoke was not unusual. Her own fire had been banked before she slept, and the smell of it lived in the walls of the house. But this smoke was different, sharper, younger, the specific acrid bite of something that should not be burning fast. She was out the door in her nightdress and her boots, unlaced, before her eyes had adjusted to the dark. The rear corner of the barn was orange. Not a small orange, not a manageable orange. The hay in the back stall had caught, and the corner beam above it was already going, and the sound it made was not the quiet sound of a fireplace. It was a living sound, a consuming sound, the sound of something that had found what it needed and was not going to stop. The horses were screaming. She went in the first time without thinking about it. The heat hit her like a wall, and the smoke was low and thick, and she found the near stall by memory rather than sight, got the halter on the gelding, and pulled him out backward into the snow. He came, shaking and wild-eyed and heavy against her arms. She went back in for the second horse, the mare, who had pressed herself into the far corner of her stall, in the specific terror of a large animal with nowhere to run. And Nora had to get her body between the mare and the wall and push, physically push, until the horse moved. She got them both out. She could not get to the chickens. She stood in the snow in her nightdress, with both horse leads in her hands, and the barn burning behind her, and she understood with the cold clarity of a person watching something inevitable complete itself that she could not stop this alone. The snow around her was bright with the fire's light. The horses pulled against her arms, and she was so completely, specifically alone in that moment. The same aloneness she had felt on the night Thomas's fever finally broke in the wrong direction, when the room went quiet and she was the only person in it, that it was almost like meeting an old acquaintance. She opened her mouth to make a sound that had no name, and the wolf howled. Not from the far ridge, from directly above the homestead, close enough that the first note of it came off the canyon wall and doubled back across the valley. Close enough that it did not fade at the edges the way a distant howl does, but arrived whole and enormous and unignorable, filling the cold air from one end of the hollow to the other. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, then silence. Then, from the north, a light appeared in a window, then another to the south. Dorothea Vass arrived first, which was something Nora would think about for years afterward. That 71-year-old Dorothea Vass, who had crossed the open pasture in the dark, in her coat over her nightclothes, with 2 buckets, and her granddaughter Marta at her heels, arrived before the Gruber brothers, before anyone else, before Nora had taken a single step toward the well. Dorothea did not say anything. She looked at the barn, looking at Nora, handed Marta one bucket, and walked to the well. They worked for the better part of an hour. The Gruber brothers arrived 8 minutes after Dorothea, and 2 other families from down the valley road came after that. And they built a line from the well to the barn, and they threw water on the rear wall until the fire stopped having room to go and began, slowly, to lose the argument. The rear third of the barn was gone. The frame was charred and open to the sky, but the front 2/3 stood, and the horses stood in the snow, shaking but whole. And when the last of the fire was out, and the steam rose from the wet and blackened wood in the cold air, Nora stood in the center of it and felt something she could not have predicted. Gratitude so sudden and physical it was almost painful. Dorothea Vass came to stand beside her. They stood in the steam and the smell of charred wood and the deep cold of a November night that was now, inexplicably, full of other people's lamplight. "I heard it too," Dorothea said. She did not say what she had heard. She did not need to. Everyone who had come across that dark pasture in their nightclothes knew what had woken them, and none of them were going to say its name in the open air at 3 in the morning. And that reticence, that collective unwillingness to name it, was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nora looked at Dorothea. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." Dorothea made a sound in her throat that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. She picked up her empty buckets. "Get those horses into what's left of the shelter," she said. "It'll be colder before morning." It would, but Nora didn't feel it the same way. When the others had gone and the horses were settled in the remaining stalls, and the fire was cold and dead, and the sky above the open rear of the barn showed the first gray suggestion of dawn, Nora walked the perimeter. She was looking for what she knew she would find. The boot prints were behind the far corner of the barn, in the snow between the burn point and the tree line that ran along the east pasture fence. 2 sets. She crouched beside them and studied them with the same deliberate attention she gave to anything that needed to be known. The right boot of one set had an uneven heel. The outside edge of the heel print was deeper, worn down on that side, in the way of a man who rolled his foot outward when he walked. The stride length of the second set was longer, a bigger man, or a man moving fast. Both sets led in a straight line toward the Holt Range Road. She found a stick and drew both prints in the dirt floor of the undamaged section of the barn, measuring with her handspan, tracing every detail she could extract from the snow before the morning warmed enough to soften the edges. Then she sent Peter Gruber at first light. He had come with his father and stayed to help stack the burnt timber, to find Cray Marsh. Marsh arrived by mid-morning. He walked the perimeter without speaking. He crouched where Nora had crouched and looked at the prints for a long time. Then he stood and looked at Nora's drawing in the dirt floor. Then he looked at Nora. Something had changed in his face. It was not a dramatic change. Cray Marsh was not a man given to dramatic changes. But the careful blankness he had worn at the hearing, that deliberate absence of position, was gone. What was underneath it was not soft, but it was present. It was the face of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing and had just seen it arrive. He took his notebook from his coat pocket and wrote everything down, every measurement, every detail. He copied her dirt floor drawing into the notebook with a precision that told her he had done this kind of work before. "I'll need to follow this road," he said. "I know," Nora said. He looked at her for a moment. "The letter you sent to Cheyenne," he said. "When did it go?" 8 days ago. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. He put his notebook away and walked to his horse. The letter reached the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne on the 14th of December. The response came in the 4th week of January, 6 weeks from the date of filing, which was faster than that office had processed anything in its institutional memory. Nora would never know precisely why. She had her suspicions about a particular deputy registrar whose name appeared on the response letter, and about the nature of professional debts in small territorial systems. But she never asked and was never told. What the letter said was this: the placement of Holt Range Company's new house trap had been confirmed in violation of the 1874 exclusion boundary. The mining claim boundary extension filed by Holt Range Company in September of 1877 was invalidated pending resurvey. The promissory note, purportedly signed by Thomas Callahan in March of 1875, had been reviewed by a territorial notary and found to be improperly witnessed under Wyoming territorial law, rendering it unenforceable against the Callahan homestead estate. Nora read the letter at her kitchen table on a January morning, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept the homestead deed and Thomas's other papers, and she put the box back on the shelf, and she went outside and started her morning work. That was the celebration. Silas Holt did not come after her again. Not directly. His mining operations slowed without the southern boundary, and his political relationships, which had always been transactional, found other transactions to pursue. He died in the spring of 1883, a smaller man in every measurable way than he had been in the autumn of 1878. The valley did not mourn him in any register that could be written down. Nora kept her land. She filed for an additional 40 acres under the Homestead Act in 1880 and received them. She extended Thomas's irrigation channels another 60 yards that same summer. The rear third of the barn, rebuilt in the spring with timber she felled herself on the East Ridge, and lumber she traded for at Whitmore's, was stronger than what had been there before. The wolf was seen on the ridge above her homestead 7 more times in the 3 years that followed. Always in winter, always alone, always still in the way he had always been still, as if stillness were his natural state, and movement was the thing he did only when necessary. The last time was January of 1882. Nora stepped out her door at first light on a Tuesday morning to check the temperature before deciding whether to break the north pasture fence ice by hand or leave it for later. She looked up at the ridge the way she always did, not expecting anything, just the habit of looking. He was there, enormous and white against the pale winter sky, in the full light of a clear morning, with none of the obscuring dusk or distance that had softened the previous sightings. He was simply there, visible and complete, exactly as he had been in the hollow 4 years ago. She looked at him. He looked at her. She raised her hand. She didn't think about it. She didn't decide to do it. Her hand simply went up, palm forward, the way you raise your hand to someone across a field when there are no words for the distance. He stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked into the tree line. She watched the place where he had been until she was certain he was not coming back. Then she went inside and poured a second cup of coffee and sat at her desk and opened her journal and wrote one sentence. I think he was saying goodbye. I think he knew something I didn't. She closed the journal. In 1995, 117 years after Nora Callahan freed a white wolf from a steel trap on the Absaroka Ridge, the United States government reintroduced gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park. 14 wolves were brought in from Canada and released into a landscape that had spent 7 decades learning to be smaller without them. The program was called, by the people who announced it, a miracle. Nora Callahan would not have called it a miracle. She would have called it overdue. She would have gotten up the next morning and gone back to work. Nora never wrote about the wolf again after that January entry. She didn't need to. Some things you carry without a word for them, and that's exactly how they should be carried. If this story found you today, that's not nothing. Hit the like button, share it with someone who still believes quiet people change things, and subscribe with the bell on. There are more of these waiting, and every single one of them is about somebody the history books almost missed.